order. It's 8:39. Could I have a roll call, please?
Chairman Vincent,
Here.
Tom Colapetro,
Here.
Henry Byrd, Bob Finnis, Rex Sims.
Here.
Fred Forbes.
Here.
Carolyn Gallagher.
Here.
Okay, we'd like to start with the agenda today. And item 3, review of the following ordinances for consistency with the City of Bonita Springs Comprehensive Plan. Audrey?
Thank
Wood?
you. We're going to have a presentation by Alexis Crespo, but before we do, I just want to explain a few things about the particular ordinance. First of all, I'm going to read the title block into the record. This has been advertised, and I have reviewed the affidavit, which is of publication, which is available at the clerk's office. This is amendments to the Bonita Springs Land Development Code, Chapter 3, Development Standards, Chapter 4, Zoning, and Chapter 6, Signs, enhancing the design standards of large-scale retail establishments. It's an amendment to Bonita Springs Land Development Code, Chapter 3, Development Standards, amending Section 3-262, Lighting Standards, and Section 3-263, bikeways and pedestrian ways to have additional standards for large-scale retail establishments, creating Section 3-426, landscape standards for large-scale retail establishments, creating Section 3-427, community space standards for large-scale retail establishments, creating Section 3-440, public transit facilities for large-scale retail establishments, creating Section 3-497, building design standards for large-scale retail establishments, and an amendment to Bonita Springs Land Development Code, Chapter 4, zoning, amending Section 3-843, use regulations for conventional commercial districts, amending Section 4-934, use regulations for planned development districts, creating Section 4-1560 through Section 4-1563, supplementary regulations for large-scale retail establishments, setting forth provisions for purpose, applicability, definitions, procedure for approval, development regulations, and building placement, and an amendment to Bonita Springs Land Development Code, Chapter 6, signs, creating Section 6-157, permanent signage for large-scale retail establishments, providing for conflicts of law, severability, codification, scrivener's errors, inclusion in code, and effective date. The City Council has scheduled it for its first reading on May 21st and its second reading on June 4th at City Council meetings. I do want to point out we have had comments from the Bonita Exchange parcel. Now, and that's what I wanted to explain before Ms. Crespo and Mr. Dolmer provide their presentations. There's been some letters, and we are trying to work with the developer on seeing what is acceptable without having to go through further steps. But in the event that we do, and I need direction from council, but I'm just letting you know what's going on. Generally, development agreements are vested in the regulations that were in effect at the time of adopting a development agreement, unless you have language specific in the development agreement that says we're contemplating doing X, Y, Z. In this particular matter, there isn't anything like that. There are some exceptions. There's about 5 exceptions, and one of the exceptions is if you put in the ordinance after a public hearing that this ordinance specifically applies to development agreements. The city has authority to do this. I don't know if the city wants to do this because we normally do not require those with a development agreement to actually follow a new ordinance. We think that we can get this worked out without adding it to the ordinance, but if we do so, the ordinance would add a whereas clause that would say something to the effect of City Council further finds that this regulation is essential for the public health, safety, or welfare, and that the regulation shall apply to any development that is subject to the development agreement, and adding in Section 4-1560, subsection A5, which is the applicability, that this ordinance shall be applicable to any development that is subject to a development agreement, since these regulations contained in LDC Chapters 3, 4, and 6 related to large-scale retail establishments are essential to public health, safety, and welfare. There is case, like I said, there is case law that if there's been change in conditions, growth of population, or other causes where you need to look at your police power, you can do so. It's not a step I would like to take. Generally, I try to look at a risk management perspective, but in this situation, you have a property that is right on I-75, and I think the planners, can better provide testimony to this effect, that, it might be a concern based on its location as to the city. With that being said, the draft that you're working on is the draft April 17th. We plan to revise it to incorporate city council comments that happened at the meeting. There were several different council members who made comments. We'll add the architectural renderings. We have them now? No, we don't. We will add them when we have them. We'll insert the use regulations. We read them in the title block, but we don't have it there. And that's basically it. At this point, do you want Alexis or you first?
Audrey?
Alexis Crespo will provide a presentation.
That Bonita Express
Bonita Exchange.
Exchange, is that the one that's over around where the Waffle House is at?
Yes, sir. It's behind the Waffle House. It's the 24 acres in the interchange quadrant.
Okay.
Before we start, could I ask for a clarification? Where, on what page is the exact description of what constitutes large-scale development?
Alexis, that would be an applicability, and there's size thresholds, and I'll let you answer that.
Correct. That is later in your ordinance, just the ordinance is chronological, so it handled Chapter 3 first. So the definition of large-scale retail establishment is on page 21 of 28.
Okay.
In section 4-1561, and we are defining that in this draft as a standalone retail establishment exceeding 40,000 square feet, or a shopping center, again, retail uses exceeding 100,000 square feet.
Okay, we just had an example of the Target store out here. Now, that was 94 square feet, so it would not have fallen in this.
It would have, because it's a standalone retail establishment, and that specific store exceeded the 40,000 square foot threshold. So it's an and or. It can either be one standalone exceeding 40,000 square feet, or if there's, let's say the anchor building in the shopping center is 25,000 square feet, but the cumulative total of shopping in that center is exceeding 100,000 square feet, then it would also be applicable, because the big box design issues that we're going to talk about today would exist with that type of development, such as lots of parking requirements and things of that nature.
Okay, my second question is, I'm looking at what's really going to happen in the real world, and one of the first things that's probably going to happen is going to be a revision of existing facilities. And I would take, for example, the shopping center on Bonita Beach Road. That's 30 years old or so, and where LA Fitness is in the back. And, okay, all that front is 30, 35 years old. And so this will apply to them also in anything they would do there.
If they renovated exceeding 50% of the assessed value, then they would be subject to these regulations. So they could do some minor renovations and not have to meet these standards, but to the extent they exceed that 50% rule, then they would have to come up to the code.
Additional question. Wouldn't we be in the same predicament that you're saying if we don't put this whereas clause with Burnwood 1, Burnwood 2? Those all are developments that have development orders.
They have development orders, but not a statutory development agreement. A development agreement is on sections 1 and 2, but they don't have commercial. That's for residential. This parcel, there's one on Racetrack. I believe we have on Racetrack, and also one on Arroyo in Pennsylvania, a very small one.
Okay, so then going on one step further, when we just completed a large expansion of the new public store over there, but the building where the Kmart was, obviously there's something going to be done back there. It's not really a freestanding building. They're all kind of hooked together, but yet Kmart is I'd say a freestanding building, but it's hooked to the others. Mm-hmm. All these rules will apply to that also
No,
now.
sir. Only if they were to go back in and apply for more than 50% of the value of that
Well,
shopping
any
center.
remodeling is more than 50% of the value in the real world.
For a shopping center, that tends to be a pretty significant sum.
Yeah, I could imagine.
Would,
All right.
Wouldn't the old Eagle, that property at the corner of Bonita Grande and Bonita Beach Road,
That's subject to this.
Yeah.
it's subject to this? Okay, that's cool.
Where does the 50% come from?
It comes from the building value, which there are generally assumed values based upon certain construction types and uses.
Okay, and the 50% is written in some of the codes somewhere, or?
It's in most building codes.
Okay.
So-
Per FEMA standards, that's a
Okay,
typical
I'm just curious.
percentage utilized.
I'm on a learning curve here.
I think
Real-
also, John, 50% of the area, if you're increasing area,
Yes, sir.
you're also impacting the possibility of having to
That's correct.
follow these guidelines. And maybe in your presentation, you could talk a little bit about the incremental remodels and how that is being addressed with the new guidelines.
And before we go on, could I go back to that agreement, with the Bonita Exchange Agreement? Question, in paragraph 4, it talks about,
Paragraph 4 on what page?
I think it's page 2 of 25. That's in the Bonita Exchange Development Agreement.
Oh, I don't have that with me.
Okay, it just talks about, you'll know this, a de minimis increase.
Correct.
So if it's less than X or more
I
than
think a de
X, what is
minimis,
X? What's it defined as?
Again, without knowing details, I think a 2% could be de minimis. I think a 5% could be de minimis. I think if you're going into 10, 15, 20%, lightning should hit the person determining it's de minimis, but that's up to the parties to determine whether or not it's de minimis. He might have a different idea of what's de minimis because you would be the one, or city council.
If there is an additional impact, whether it's traffic, whether it's demands upon public utilities, that is no longer de minimis because there is an impact which has resulted in a change in the required infrastructure and the requirement that the public has to provide for them. So when I look at plans, if you have shifted buildings around, the square footage could change, and it could actually be up to 10%. And depending on how that is used and how it is permitted, it may or may not have an impact or not. It may be a de minimis impact that we may look at as something that has not changed the need for public infrastructure. It has not created demand that we would have to address. Therefore, it is de minimis.
Okay, so it's no particular number.
It
It depends on the situation.
It is not a particular number because there are a number of factors that could create an impact. And as opposed to going through every single one and potentially missing one, it's just listed generically as de minimis, so we have the ability to evaluate the entire project.
And I have one other little thing. I'm just curious, on the same agreement on number 11, they reference a Florida statute 163.3223, parentheses 2. I think that's the wrong number. I think it's 163.3.
Not going to be changed, but
3233.
if there's a.
Because I pulled it up in the Florida statutes, so they have a wrong number there. Sorry.
Why don't we proceed with the presentation?
Okay. I have prepared a thorough PowerPoint presentation. I know the LPA likes to get into the exact language, so I understand there's some time constraints as well, so we'll try to get through everything today. We do have our first reading next week before council, so certainly want to get through the content. And if you're comfortable with any of this language and want me to just speed up through it, just give me the signal. I wanted to start off with just a little bit of background on some of the design issues associated with large-scale retail or big box uses, which really was the impetus for creating this ordinance. Also, just give you a summary of the City Council's directive based upon meetings we've had with them since January of this year, and then, of course, get into our proposed amendments. So what are the major design issues we were looking to address through this ordinance? Again, building upon what we just discussed, this is not intended for mom and pop small retail establishments. This is for your national big box retailers. This is Walmart, this is Costco. Public stores, for the most part, would meet that threshold, but this is not for your smaller retail businesses. So there's a really select few amount of establishments in the city of Bonita that will need to comply with these standards. And so what issues do we have when we look at big box? One of the most common complaints is the sea of parking effect, where the store is set back deep into the property, several hundred feet, and you've got about 500 to 700 parking spaces that really dominate that view shed from your adjacent arterial roadway. And so it can impact the view of the city as you're traveling along your major thoroughfares, and also just can create that heat island sea of parking effect, which can be impactful to the aesthetics of the city. Architectural design quality. The stores have been stepping up. I think what we've seen in looking at other examples throughout the country is they are looking to get away from that monolithic rectangular box type form. Cities are creating standards to force them to get away from that and add some more architectural details to these buildings to have them really emulate the city's character and the quality aesthetic they're looking to achieve. So we certainly, through this effort, and Mr. Vincent really was the force behind that, looked at ways to increase the architectural value of these types of buildings. As if falling to the minimum standards, they can, again, be monolithic, rectangular, and fairly plain in their architectural quality. Signage, also a key item. When you have multiple stores within a shopping center or a big box that wants to use pylon or pole signs to really get that visibility. So we're looking to seek a balance with that. I will note that we actually are going to be removing the signage from this ordinance, as staff has created a separate signage ordinance that deals with signage more on a holistic basis and not just for big box. So we did look at it, and you will have another ordinance to review regarding signage. Access, both pedestrian and vehicular. These uses are often very auto-dependent. People are coming to and from by vehicle, and that's typically how the site design functions. It's really oriented to get the cars in and out, and not giving much attention to people who may arrive by bicycle, who need to walk through the parking lot to get from their car to the store, and looking at how we can enhance public health, safety, welfare by addressing those internal connections and external connections, which Councilwoman Martin did recommend we look at even further based on the draft she reviewed. And then the sum of all these items are your impacts on your major corridors. These stores, due to the access needs that they have, are going to be located on your major arterial roadways at major intersections, gateways to the community. And we want to make sure that we combine all these different design factors to ensure that these gateway properties are reflective of the quality of design that Bonita Springs wants to see. So I've got a couple of pictures to run through to show you what we were talking about and the design issues we're looking to mitigate through these standards. Parking lot orientation. This is kind of that sea of parking effect, minimal vegetation, the store setback, and it's all parking with minimal breakup of that parking area. So how can we look at alternatives so that the view from the street is not just that sea of parking? This is an example from City of Fort Myers. This may not work on every property, certainly, but this is an example of an alternative that was implemented to create a very attractive view shed from a major corridor, which in this case is McGregor Boulevard. And then here's more of a suburban example from Boynton Beach, where liner buildings were utilized to block the view of the parking lot. The big box stores behind those liner buildings, and there's also a nice kind of gateway entrance to the development as well, which adds some aesthetic value. Architecture, this is kind of your standard Target store in a location where the code doesn't require a high level of architectural detail on these types of buildings. And so we were looking at getting to that next level, because we know that these stores have prototypes to address modern or contemporary architecture, Mediterranean. When they're going into different parts of the country, they want to emulate that character where the codes require it, and we're looking to ensure that we get a higher quality of their prototype buildings when they come into town. Signage, this is the pylon pylon sign at the Gladiolus and 41 Walmart. It's big. It's not very attractive. And then here's another example of a sign that Walmart has done in the Naples area. It's a monument-style sign. It's got different textures, softened colors, obviously a much higher aesthetic value. So how can we create standards that result in this type of signage as opposed to the big pylon-type sign? Access. This is an example of the current standards and what the type of access is usually implemented based on current codes. And you can see there is a walking area for pedestrians down the middle. There's no curb stops to really protect the pedestrian environment in this case. and there's no difference. It's the same asphalt parking lot surface area, so there's very little definition that this is the pedestrian walkway. So we looked at an example from the Naples area as well, where brick pavers were utilized to differentiate that pedestrian area, and plantings were used, and different design was implemented to ensure a safe pedestrian environment so that they're not walking through the middle of the parking lot and interacting with vehicles that may not be seeing them. So those were the design issues, high-level summary of what we were looking to achieve here. Council directed us to start this process in January of this year. They were looking to ensure that any big box coming into Bonita has a very high-quality design, and not just the basic standard that they would implement anywhere else in the country, but that we look to really achieve a Bonita-specific look for the big box coming in. We also wanted to look at protection of established residential neighborhoods. Again, Councilwoman Martin felt very strongly that we look at buffering, hours of operation, things of that nature, to ensure that any neighboring residential use would be protected. Also, strong emphasis on pedestrian connectivity in and out of the site, as well as internal to the site. And it's also been a strong feedback that a public hearing process is appropriate for these, again, large-scale buildings. There's not going to be that many that come into your city. And so when they do, you want to have that review process to ensure that you have the site-specific conditions in place to ensure that it is a quality development. So let's get into the, are there any questions at this point? Yes, sir?
I'd like to go back to the signage, the two shots you had of the Walmart sign. Okay. Now, I can sort of agree that that's a little oversized, but I will make a point that the next one is undersized. And if you travel the country, as I've been known to do, and you're looking for a place like that, those little shrubs that are around there tend to grow.
Right.
And you will go by a place you're looking for and make U-turn after U-turn looking for something like that. And I noticed in here that there was a comment about it, 36 inches of monument before the actual sign. I would hope you can strike a better balance. There's too much difference between the two.
Okay.
The first one's a little oversized. That one's definitely undersized.
Okay.
You have to look at it from a roadway point of view. All those plantings grow up just like the ones right out here in front of City Hall, which are grown up again. And if you're trying to make that cut across and you're not driving a high-top van, you can't see traffic coming from the other way. So,
And just so
my point.
I don't disagree. What you need to find is that balance between visibility and aesthetic standards.
Exactly.
And what we have currently, and what we're kind of working from as a starting point, was the regulations on Bonita Beach Road. And right now we're looking at 7 feet from the crown of the road being the maximum height, which is good for Bonita Beach Road because you have a relatively narrow roadway. The speeds don't tend to be that high. It's easier to see. The properties tend to be a little bit smaller. For US 41, I think what we're going to do is look at maybe a slight expansion because the right-of-way is much wider. The properties are set back off of the road a little bit, and visibility does become a concern because the speeds are higher. So we are looking to strike that balance. I think that these are very good examples, but they give you a picture of the direction we're going. They really don't give you an idea of what exists currently and what we're looking for here. So I hear what you're saying, and I think that when the sign ordinance comes back, you'll see that we're looking to strike that balance, and we'll see if we've done a good job or not.
Hopefully. Thank you.
And to further to that, we're going to be removing this Chapter 6 revisions from this ordinance based upon the fact that staff is working on a separate ordinance, so they'll be taken out.
What I'm looking for in this ordinance is that if Super Walmart wants to come in, that we're going to get a store and a development that at least is as nice as the one they're doing in Estero. In your research, did you guys look at what they're getting? Because to me, if we get anything as good as they get, doesn't have to look the same, but if it's nicely done on the site, if the architectural aesthetics are as well handled, that's where we want to be. And I don't believe that Naples stores, at least on the Super Walmart, have that character.
And the Collier code for their existing Walmarts had not been updated to the standard
Right,
that they are
yeah.
today. We obviously looked at Estero. We looked at national examples as well. This is not a replication of the Estero code by any means. I think we've actually taken it in some cases a step further than Estero has taken
Yeah,
it.
all I want is, it doesn't have to, I don't want it to look like a stereo,
Right.
but I want it to be as nice or nicer. I don't, because probably one of those big box stores is going to end up east I-75, and I want to see something that's nice rather than something that isn't as nice.
Absolutely.
Fred, along those very lines, the thing that you have to put in the back of your mind, a concern, is that I've had is, for example, when Lowe's had the property here in Bonita,
Right.
and there were Larry was chairman here, and they more or less wrote a specific design for them, and obviously it was substantially more expensive than the regular old big box store. In my mind, I don't know why they didn't build here, but I have always wondered if their cost per square foot exceeded some requirement that they have down in the file cabinet that they look at, because it does increase your saleable cost or leasable cost per square foot substantially, and that is something that this is a competitive world out here that is a factor.
Yeah, the only two comments I'd offer, from the residents' point of view, which I call us the stakeholders, if we didn't buy here and pay the taxes, this city wouldn't be what it is. And it didn't stop them from spending their money in Estero. It didn't stop Lowe's from spending the money they spent at the corner of Corkscrew and what is it, in Three Oaks or
Parkway.
whatever. I think we've got a great city, and the way to bring it up is we got to bring up our architectural standards, so.
If you provide architectural standards that have a purpose and that provide a direction, you
Right.
don't tend to see the same resistance than if you just have architectural standards for the sake of having architectural standards. If you're looking to accomplish a goal and you have a predictable path towards approval and somebody knows what they need to do to obtain approval, that's a situation where you don't tend to have a lot of disagreement because the rules are firmly established and they're very clear.
Right.
Right now, and I'll go into this a little bit more later on, but right now you have architectural standards that are intended to break up massing and scale, and that is about it. And as a result, you've seen a hodgepodge of architecture design coming in. Sometimes it looks very attractive, and sometimes it doesn't. We're looking to take what we currently have and provide more clarity and direction, and also provide additional standards that are going to provide additional safety on these sites. One of the biggest problems with these sea of parking lots is getting from one side to the other, and it truly does become a safety issue. So without those access aisles that Alexis had shown you earlier, you really wind up with a situation where you could be walking 300 yards in the middle of traffic. And if it is in the middle of September, probably not a big deal. But if you are walking that same 300 yards in January, quite possibly you're taking your life in your hands. So we're looking to create a set of standards that builds off what we have, but to provide additional clarity and to provide additional safety for the public.
Okay.
All right, thank you. Okay, so we have two chapters to look through today. Again, chapter 6 is going to be thrown out of this ordinance, so we really have a lot in chapter 3 and then chapter 4 to review. So this is the summary of the various sections we're amending as part of this ordinance in your development standards chapter. We'll start with bikeways. We also touch on lighting, landscaping, community open space, transit, and of course the building design standards, architectural standards. I'll give you a high-level summary of these. I won't read this verbatim, but the first section is your bikeways and pedestrian ways, your internal and external access to these sites. So what this amendment is looking to accomplish is to ensure that the sidewalks are provided along the full length of the building, 8 foot in width, and no more than 6 foot from the entrance. again, to provide that pedestrian connectivity separate from the traffic areas. We're also encouraging additional building features, street furniture that have been also proven to help create a pedestrian-friendly environment. There's a numbering issue here. Second A is talking about weather protection along those entrances to the store, having awnings at a maximum of 15%, colonnades and different things to provide weather protection for people entering and exiting the store based on, you know, our Florida weather patterns. So again, creating a comfortable pedestrian environment that also addresses safety. Also looking at a new concept which we build upon later in the ordinance, which is the divider median concept, which is providing clear pedestrian aisles running perpendicular to the store at intervals throughout the parking lot to create those clearly defined access points for pedestrians so they're not walking in the middle of the parking lot, as John has pointed out. Also requiring that there be a different surface for those pedestrian walkways as opposed to the asphalt for the rest of the parking lot. So again, those pedestrian areas are clearly defined. In terms of bike racks, we threw that in at a late stage in this process, and we realized that the requirement was somewhat excessive. The first strike-through part says that one bike rack can accommodate a minimum of 10 bicycles for every 100 required parking spaces. So when you do the math, these stores often have, you know, 500 to 700 parking space requirements. So that's a lot of bike parking. That's not an acceptable ratio based on national standards. So we did a little research since this was proposed and came up with one bike rack per 5,000 square feet of building area. I have not vetted that with staff yet, but that was an alternative I wanted to propose. And so if you have let's say you have 150,000 square foot super Walmart, you'd need 30 bike rack spaces, which would seem like an acceptable ratio. And this was taken, I believe, from Portland, Oregon, which is a very bike-friendly area. So they're kind of the creme de la creme when it comes to providing for bicycles. So we thought that was acceptable and more reasonable than the initial excessive requirement that we had come up with. Okay, that was it for pedestrian and bicycles. So moving on to lighting. This is pretty minor, just too small, again, a numbering error there, or letter error. But basically, two concepts. We didn't want to create a situation where canopy trees and lighting were in the same plantable median area, because what happens is your tree matures, it blocks the lighting, your parking lot is no longer meeting the lighting standards required for safety, so you clear cut the top of the tree. This has happened in Southwest Florida in some of the older established big box developments, and it's really created a lot of public outcry because it's not attractive. So let's avoid a situation where we're going to have to clear cut mature oak trees to ensure adequate lighting, and let's locate them in separate islands to avoid that conflict. The second point here is if you're going to be locating your light poles in the middle of the parking lot outside of these plantable areas, a curbing around that light pole would be required. And that's really an aesthetic, also a safety item to create the situation where the pole's just growing right out of the pavement. You get the cracking, and it's so providing that clearly defined base for the lighting if it's not within your plantable median area. Okay, getting into landscaping. This was a big focus, and in addition to the architecture, we really looked at the landscaping standards as that can really enhance that view shed when you have a nice amount of planting in the parking lot. So the first area is addressing stormwater design standards from your comprehensive plan regarding runoff, watering, et cetera, to build in a sustainability component into this ordinance. We were also proposing that building perimeter plantings be required along all sides of the building, as often all sides of the buildings can be visible from surrounding streets. And then requiring an enhanced buffer, actually allowing for a decreased buffer where you orient your building towards the street. So if you're blocking parking completely from your adjacent roadway through a building, then you can do a slightly less amount of plantings or an alternative landscape plan because you're already softening the view shed through the use of the building, that you wouldn't need to do as many required plantings in your classic type D buffer. So creating balance in this. We're creating things that are going to obviously increase the development costs, but trying to offset that in other ways where aesthetics can be addressed alternatively. Okay, here is the enhanced planning requirement where large-scale big box is adjacent to residentially zoned or developed properties. We're suggesting that a type C perimeter buffer be provided to screen the residential use in addition to a wall. Because these obviously have trucks coming in and out, delivering goods, often early in the morning or late at night, a lot of lighting. Some of them are open 24 hours a day, so there's obviously conflicts with residential should they be in the surrounding areas. So we're looking at an enhanced buffer to ensure those established neighborhoods are protected.
If I can ask a question right there.
Yes, sir.
Can you give us an example of the type C perimeter buffing? Can you do that? We need Mike to do that.
A type C is 15 feet wide. Oh, I have it right here. Oh, that's lucky. Your type C buffer is 15 feet in width, 5 trees per 100 linear feet, and 18 shrubs per 100 linear feet with the wall.
With the wall?
With a wall, yes, sir.
How tall's the wall?
8 feet.
This is screening
That can be a berm wall combo.
the activities to the rear of the store when it buffers, or when it's adjacent to residential, right?
Correct. This would only be applicable where adjacent to residential.
These establishments will be large enough that they will have a separate behind loading dock area, because we're talking about separation of the truck entrance with the public entrance.
Right.
I'm thinking about one of the worst examples you have in the world is over here at CVS, where the semis unload in the parking lot right in front of the door. But this is 150,000 square feet, so that would not be applicable to a situation like that.
Yes, sir. For buildings that are retail in nature, over 40,000 square feet, it is generally assumed there's going to be deliveries.
Okay.
There's really no way, other
Right.
than with large trucks, you can stock.
I have a kind of a silly question. We're looking at buffering because of visibility and noise and things like that. What about in the possibility of there being odors or something? Is there anything that they do? Are there any ordinances already on the books to
Okay.
protect us from that? Good.
There are.
Okay. Now we're getting into proposals for internal landscaping within the site. The intent here is to require more plantings to shade the parking areas. And by requiring more plantings, you have more planted medians within your parking lot, which is going to break up that parking area into smaller chunks so you don't get the, again, to overuse the statement, the sea of parking effect. So we,
Pardon me. Are you taking questions as we go along
I
here?
think
or are
that's
you
a great
waiting?
way to do this, yes, sir.
How we
It
do
might be good to do that because it's very long and very
Okay.
complex.
At this particular area, I have a couple of questions pertaining to policy, I think. Under D3, it talks about the definition of the landscaping island, which is 10 by 20, which is the legal size of a parking lot, a parking space. So when we're figuring square feet, we are taking a parking space out of the parking lot. So under 3, that's a definition of 10 by 20. And then under 4, it requires one of these dividers every 8 rows of parking spaces. And my question is, for example, in a medical installation where the parking requirements are substantially higher than a retail installation, does the developer get any credit for these island parking spaces?
They are islands are required in any parking lot. In every 10 spaces, you need to provide a landscape island. So no, there's no credit. It is a requirement. And in terms of the medical uses, these standards would not apply. This would just be for retail.
This is just for retail, okay?
Yes, sir.
Big box.
Yes, sir.
Big box. Okay, if my math is right, and I'm looking at this, in a 320-foot space, they're going to lose 40 feet, which, you know, is a substantial amount of square footage that you're buying this dirt, but you essentially don't have any use of it except to comply with our regulations. And that somehow or another seems to be a relatively large amount in a larger.
Well, that is definitely one way to look at it. But if you look at how many of the larger scale retail developers have operated their sites, they have their own parking standards.
Okay.
And they generally tend to be in excess of most jurisdictions. So they will plan to construct parking to their ratios per square foot. And as opposed to providing those large parking areas that are simply asphalt from one side of the building all the way to the property line, what we're looking at doing is breaking that up a little bit and also providing some access measures in there. So it's easier to find the parking spot with shade in the summertime.
All right. Now, I have no problem with that. But yesterday, I was down at Physicians Regional, waiting there in the car while I was reading this. And so I just happened to count the spaces between the ones down there, and there happened to be 12. And so in the Physicians parking lot, Physicians Regional. And so I'm saying, is 8 a magic number, or is that something that we just pulled out of the hat, or how do we arrive at 8?
What you'll see in Collier, or at least what used to be in Collier, I'm not sure what the current regulations are, and currently in Bonita Springs, is you have to have an average of 10 in other uses. So you could go 12 spaces in one, but then you would drop down to 8
Okay.
in another area, and so you would average 10. This is a little bit higher of a standard, but it's also based upon the size of the parking area. And
Okay.
because-
Cut to my question real quick.
Yes, sir.
Before we can go on. But is 8, is a magic number 8, is it restrictive?
no, sir.
Okay.
Question, what is the width of the landscape strip on the frontage and the side frontages?
The buffer, the perimeter buffer,
Yeah, mm-hmm.
typically, if it's on a roadway, it'd be 15 feet wide.
How many feet?
15 foot wide is your typical type D buffer.
15 feet.
That's not relative to internal landscaping, though.
Well, then one other, and now I'm done. When we go a little bit further back in this, we're talking about community seating arrangements and so forth, which are required as part of this thing. That then is not counted in their parking credits. They're not giving any credit for this
No, sir,
community area.
but you start getting into another area with that community space. You're already required to provide 30% open space. So whatever your property is, 30% of that's going to be dedicated to open space. A portion of that now is what we're looking at providing for this community area. And it's community area, so if you and I are waiting for someone to pick us up, or we just sit, we have no place to be, so we sit outside for a minute.
Vagrants.
But what also tends to happen is you have employees that work in these stores that have time for breaks and for meals, and there is no accounting for that use. There is no space for them to be outside. And if you have area that's already set aside for open space, the thought of actually providing an area for someone to leave the building for a few minutes before they go back in, it really
Okay.
seems to make sense. There are requirements for these. You'll see in Collier, you'll see in Sarasota County, you'll see in certain portions of the East Coast. And where they're done right and where they're properly located and built, they work very well. I can also point to a handful of examples where they've just been put in a corner of a piece of property that has no direct relationship to the building and has no real access, and they sit there. And they're not used. The intent of this is to provide a space for especially the employees, but for the general public as well, to have a place just to be outside. And if you already have space that is dedicated to be open, This actually makes it usable.
Okay, good.
Okay, let's proceed.
I'll go one chapter, one paragraph down under 5. It says, all exterior mechanical equipment,
Oh.
utility meters and valves. And you have a problem there because you get those giant backflow preventers, which are required by our utility and fire department access, and you're not going to plant stuff around them. Those are exposed, so you got to have some kind of an exception there.
You can plant around them. You cannot plant right next to them, and you cannot enclose them. That is true. They have to have access to those. But there are ways in which to landscape and to design those so that they work more with the architecture of the building as opposed to standing out as monoliths to utility design.
Well, the one I think of in particular, and I'm sure it wouldn't happen again, is that one on Beach Road. That's right on the sidewalk in front of that
yes, sir.
condo. I mean, geez, you want to talk about ugly, but
It's a nice
you know,
color.
how are
though.
you? Yeah. Oh, it's a very nice color. Yeah. Was that part of the palette?
Yes.
Oh, okay.
To explain what is a lift station, what are different.
But yeah, I mean, it just says it's got to be screened, and I don't know if that's going to be hard and fast. If there's got to be leeway there in order to get access to those things.
We could add a statement.
I
That-
would suggest that maybe we can make a real fast consultation with the fire marshal. My understanding is on a lot of that you can plant, I think it's within 6 feet maybe on either side of it and in the front or something like that. But it's got to be, there's got to be enough room where they can get in to either service it or take care of an emergency like a fire plug or whatever.
Yeah. I think that's been duly noted, and I think you can probably proceed from there and see what we can do to screen some of these items without,
And that's why it's a general guideline. It doesn't
Yeah.
say you have to have a 36-inch hedge that surrounds 3 sides of the utility. It's supposed to be a common sense measure that if you have the option of putting the backflow preventers here, or you have the option to put them here, and having them on one side of the property makes sense, you have your directive.
Okay.
Before we leave this page, could I make a comment on administration? Because when we leave the last number on this page, which is 6 in little Roman numerals, then we go to the next page, there's a diagram, and then we go to a C. And I feel like there may be something missing here. And also, there's a spot on the next page where I feel like something might be missing, or it's misnumbered.
Yeah, we're expecting some architectural renderings. I believe that might be what you're looking at.
No, that goes under the.
Okay, because we go from page 13, the bottom, which is number 6 in Roman numerals, and then we go to C on the next page, which doesn't follow.
I agree that
There-
should be a E. The C on page 14 should be E and then F.
Okay,
I think that,
I mean,
Jo-
just to make the document look nice.
sure.
John, going back to what you had said about backflow preventers and other, sometimes, I don't call them ugly, but they're not beautiful. Can't we just put in there that between location and screening, they must end up with a location and/or screening that shields this stuff from view?
To the
and then
greatest
give
extent
some
possible.
guidelines.
Um,
Because if you just leave it that, common sense will do it, common sense is going to be what's the cheapest way to get it done.
Well, if you look, do you not think that the language in V or 5 addresses that concern? Do you think it should be rephrased?
Well, I would rephrase it kind of like I said, it has to be, but you can balance it by where it's located versus how you screen it.
I'll see what we can come up with. I
Okay.
don't have any problems because I think we're saying the same thing, and I
Okay.
think our goal is the same. So
I just don't want to get in a position where it's subject to a lot of interpretation, because it will end up in the most economical way, so to speak.
okay.
Did you want to interject something here? You look like you were ready to.
No?
Okay,
Oh.
I have one more on the next page below that, the diagram there, under D.
Okay.
It's looking for temporary cart storage must be screened by a landscape island no less than 4 feet in width. Is that not a little, are we not asking, I mean, it looks like we're taking another parking place there.
Well, they're typically located in a parking space. Your shopping cart is located in a parking spot. We're just saying located in a parking spot next to your island to screen the
Okay,
use.
okay.
It can be done a number of
That's-
ways.
Okay, I got it. All right.
I think, if I mention here, maybe you want to say something about it as well, is the overall intent of the big box. What we're trying to do here is to more beautify these properties than we are to give up to utilitarian needs. I think that's one of the goals of big box here is, and that's where you have to separate your mindset from traditional kinds of small store requirements into something that's big box. And if you take a look at big box, they all have been upgrading their standards due to requirements such as ours. So the goal here is not to reduce what they do, but to enhance the environment in which they find themselves. And so I think some small things like this we want to take a look at and be careful with, that we are providing these standards in that nature.
Correct.
That is for the betterment of the entire community if we don't end up with seas of concrete and asphalt, but instead we soften the environment around a big box. A 150,000 square foot store is a very large store. It has very large dimensions, so whatever we can do, even small, is going to help towards relieve that sort of big box.
A very interesting picture she had along that very lines a few minutes ago, where there was an arch and the big box was in the back and the out parcels were in the front. And I look at that, especially in Europe where land is so precious, that's not just common, that's every day.
Every day.
And so I look at that and say that is an avenue that shields that big box and softens its impact with our out parcels up in front. And I see that as a coming thing.
I do too, and I think the other thing to remember here as we look at these big box ordinances is where they are located. There's going to be some situations here where we're getting big box on the interstate at the interchange. And I think you should take to heart here, that's the entrance to our community.
Right.
And so how do we feel about a large building like that with more parking than landscaping and the idea of this huge box sitting out on the interstate? So that's another issue that's going to be coming up here.
Right.
Could we just go back to the carts a second? I think I might have misunderstood. You know, people leave them in the parking lot a lot of times, so were you saying that you would actually have covered or areas where the carts could be left in the parking lot? Or,
Temporary, we've noted it wouldn't be a permanent holding area for the
It's-
carts, but
okay, because that is a mess, but
during the
At
day.
the
I'm
grocery
guilty of
store,
that.
You're familiar with those areas. You can put the shopping cart back in there. What you can do with those is you can either relocate those next to a landscape island, as Alexis had outlined, or if you want to take another space, if you choose, you can put them in another area that would have been a parking space, but you put that 4-foot landscaping there beside it. This is one of those areas, I know that there was a question, well, is 4 foot really a good idea? If you want to see how good intentions went wrong, the Target at Gulf Coast Town Center is a good example because they do have this, but the landscape strip beside the cart area is probably about 2.5 to 3 feet wide. And the landscaping that's in there is dead. It's very difficult to maintain in that narrow of an area. So that's why we were looking for the 4 feet. It wasn't to become excessive. It was to make sure that when we're making a requirement, the requirement can actually function.
And if I may, John mentioned something, and it was the Target at, I believe, Gulf Coast, or the Target at Coconut. One of the other things that was suggested by Ms. Montgomery that we'll be adding to the ordinance, I haven't talked to staff about it yet, Mr. Schwing is familiar, is having the shopping carts have the automatic lock. But obviously, we're not going to control the radius as tight as they do, because sometimes if you go too, just a little bit too far, and that prevents people from stealing the shopping carts. Yep.
Okay, let's move on.
Okay. We kind of, I think, covered everyone's questions on landscaping, so I don't know that we need to
Yes.
go any further through that. So let's get to the community space concept. So as John mentioned, this is not in addition to the open space requirement. We're simply saying your commercial developments require 35% open space, and of that 35%, 10% should be what we consider usable community space. So it's not in addition to anything that they already have to do or more land that has to be set aside. It's simply repurposing some of that open space to, again, provide space for employees and patrons of the site. And so we've listed examples of what that could be, and running through those. Usable green space, that could be a green area with a bench. Also, water features with a seating area. These developments are going to have stormwater management ponds, so simply adding a gazebo feature, bench feature with some cover will meet this requirement, and something that they're already doing with minimal added expense, but just adding to the experience of the development. Adding a water fountain in the lake could also achieve the intent of this section. So it's really not intended to be overly onerous or increase the land area they're going to already have to set aside to meet the code requirements. It's simply, again, creating some focal points within the development. And again, drawing from examples from across the nation where this is being implemented, as well as in Florida. Having pedestrian access to these community spaces was required, and that you couldn't double dip if you were having an outdoor seating area with a on-site restaurant. That could not count as your community open space.
Let me
Are
ask
any
you-
of these areas supposed to have shade in particular? I mean, is that required?
It's not necessarily required through the language. It's certainly, we mentioned gazebo, pedestrian plazas. We haven't made a requirement that each one of these areas has to be shaded, though.
And if I may, this is another area, there's some case law. We have, in the language that Alexis has is a minimum area. I'm going to be suggesting a maximum area so that it meets the rough proportionality test. The rough proportionality test is so that any regulation is not considered arbitrary. It has to relate to the property. So it makes sense to have a minimum area. I definitely agree there. But you need a maximum. Otherwise, you might have, if it's set at, I believe, 10%, 10% if you have, many acres can get to be almost the whole town in itself of community space. So,
Not to exceed a certain acreage per.
or square feet. Right, for the
Okay,
community space.
that makes sense.
So whether it's 2,000, whatever you think's appropriate, so that we don't have somebody having an obligation of 80,000 or 100,000 of community space. I don't think that was the intent.
No.
One other little thing that is under the landscaping, and I don't think it's addressed, but someplace in here, it's talking about the fence that's going to shield the loading dock area from the back, and I have no problem with that. I have a problem with a thing like is happening on the corner of Three Oaks and Corkscrew, where they're building this huge fortress thing that covers about a half a block. I want to make sure that we're not injecting anything that will allow something like that to be built.
What I think you're talking about is that residential developments on
Yes.
the southwest corner. What
The fortress.
correct. Now, what they've done is they've cleared that area and they've placed the wall up, but what hasn't been installed is any of the landscaping.
Is landscaping.
Correct.
But it's
So-
still going to look like a penitentiary,
Correct.
no matter what you do.
What I think we've tried to do with this is you have the softer aspects of the buffering, which is the landscaping. You have the harder aspect of the buffering, which is the wall.
Right.
You try to balance the two so that you don't have a penitentiary, but at the same
But there's
time.
no break in this thing, you see?
I-
Now, the new wall out on Three Oaks at Bonita Island, or Bonita Lakes, I think it is, it has a wall and landscaped, and it's beautiful, but it has some breaks in it from
Well,
time
there's
to time.
good news there because Ms. Crespo has already made changes to our walls. When was that? That was
a while ago.
a while ago. So there is a break every 100 feet. I forget how many
Yes.
feet it was.
Yes. So that it gets away from the penitentiary look. We just don't have guarded shacks in the corner.
Rex,
Just
I
shoot
think in that
peasants.
that particular case out here in Imperial, isn't that fence, that stucco fence within 10 feet of the back of the curb? It's pretty close.
I don't know what the distance is, but you're right. It's
Very close, and I think,
Doesn't leave a lot of room for.
right, I think here what we're talking about though is 15 feet, which is substantial.
Okay,
Correct.
I'm
And
sorry.
there's, that's a residential community, and there's no way that a big box is going to put an 8-foot wall along their frontage because that would block their, we're already trying to soften the view, so they're not going to want to put in the expense of a wall. I mean,
but someplace
I don't
in the
see-
back they are.
In the back,
Yes.
yes, sir. That's where
And
this
the
would be
back
intended, or
of that
sides.
store is the front to somebody.
Correct. And
That's true, but but that goes back to what we were saying. I mean, you really need to provide that balance because there is no better visual barrier than a wall.
Right.
But at the same time, nobody wants to stare at a blank wall.
I think what we're going to see too, Rex, is in the architectural requirements, we're going to be addressing all sides of the big box
Good.
as well. A question I'd like to bring up here having to do with the community space, is there an adjacency preference that we would like to have when you talk about a community space? I know in the architectural portion, we talk about it being adjacent to the entry, 200 square feet. So can this community space be have a preference to being closer to entrances or to the center itself?
I don't personally have a preference. I have seen them, depending on how the building is oriented and what the site is dimensioned, I've seen good community space close to the right-of-way, and I've seen good community space just adjacent to the side of the building. And one of the reasons I really didn't get too deep into it was because these are going to be items that come through a public hearing process, so there is going to be that meeting and discussion and review of those plans before they even get to City Council for their decision. If there's strong feelings one way or another, I don't have an objection, but I've seen it done well and I've seen it done poorly in different portions of the site.
Yeah, I'm just curious because I think in regulations, you can also, the preference would be such and such. And
That's no
let,
problem.
to really give them food for thought.
Mm-hmm.
For example, rather than being out on the ring road, you might have community space that's closer for people who don't want to shop, and they would be right next to convenient parking and so forth.
I think if you start providing direct pedestrian access or specific pedestrian access from the building to the community space,
yes.
you start to at least require a connection. And if you want to take that a step further, like I said, I really don't have any
Yeah.
objections to it because I've seen it done well and I've seen it done poorly regardless of where it is.
If I can make suggestions, is that we do address that, and because you can have landscaping that is an adjunct to that would be pretty nice as part of the softening of the big box facades.
Correct. The one thing I want to think about in adding that is a really nice piece of usable community space that could be provided is along your stormwater management lake, which will typically not be close to your building. So I wouldn't want to discourage that specific
Right.
inclusion. But in general, I agree having it close to the building would also
Okay.
be the asset.
Question, on, on the screen wall that would be at the back of the stores, is 8 feet really high enough? Because the big thing you have is semis and,
Well, you have...
We've
you
actually
have-
specified a 12-foot wall for the
Correct.
loading wall.
And you're correct, but you also, like many areas in this ordinance, you have to find a balance because while you want to provide that visual barrier, you don't want to provide a prison wall.
no.
So what is that height? And I think 12 feet is a good balance.
Oh, yeah, I was thinking more like 10.
Okay, let's
Okay.
let's move on.
And just to close that loop on that conversation, the type C planning, which again is a considerable amount of trees and shrubs, are going to be on the residential side of the wall to soften the look of that. So it's not a prison wall type situation. Okay. So we have talked, now we're into transit. This is a pretty minor section we added that these establishments either be located within a quarter mile of a transit stop, which shouldn't necessarily be a difficult thing considering where they're likely going to be located on your arterial roads where Lee Tran service exists, or provide a transit stop within the development if they're not within that quarter mile radius. That would include a roofed shelter, a minimum of 50 square feet, a bench within the transit stop, and the shelter would be subject to architectural review if it's within the development to make sure it's architecturally consistent with the big box.
Could I suggest something?
Yes, ma'am.
Could we add something about lighting within that shelter,
Yes,
particularly for people who might be waiting there for a bus at night?
that's a good idea.
It changes the maintenance obligations for those shelters, and normally it's transit who has to provide it, so.
You can check with Lee Tran on.
It's a safety issue.
Yes, I know, it's a safety issue for lighting too, because sometimes lighting might sound like it's better, but it's not always.
Or located adjacent or near within a certain feet to a street light.
And
I
another
was going
issue-
to say that it didn't have to be in the shelter. It could be shining light on the shelter from,
Yeah, I think
Being
power
adjacent.
might be hard to get in locations that are remote.
The
So I
other
think
thing-
next to a light, street light would be.
Is the hours of
Yeah.
operation for Lee Tran is not, it's not like we're running, buses till 2 AM.
Right.
So I don't know if there's lighting. There's a lot of liability issues when you start
Yeah.
looking at, putting in requirements to add lighting.
yeah. There could be some liability if you didn't, though.
Actually, you have more liability if you put it in
And
and you
it
do
doesn't
not
work.
provide,
Okay.
or if you
Yeah.
provide it and then something happens to it.
I got this from the city of Albuquerque. They have that in their plan, and they require the city to maintain it. I'm not necessarily suggesting that.
Yeah,
I'm-
and we can, but that would be a major
Um,
policy decision. I would be careful about that.
Well, you wouldn't have to. You could require them to operate it, too. It's just, to me, it's a safety issue, particularly when we don't have daylight
No,
saving time.
I agree, it's a safety issue. It's just sometimes there's unintended consequences when you draft it in your documents.
The lighting only becomes a question if it's internal to the site. If it's along the right-of-way, you have
Well,
street lighting.
like somebody said, put in an extra street light or something so it shines on the
Well, I don't even
shelter.
think based on how they're lit, I don't even know if you need to put in an additional light. It only becomes, the center of Bonita Springs is the only facility I know that really has one in Bonita Springs that has an internal stop. That's going to be the only time that this would come into play, in my opinion, which we can take a look in to see what we can do.
Let me make a suggestion, if the board doesn't mind. Before we comment, won't we wait till we go through a whole section and then comment? Because we still have quite a bit left in front of us here. So let's wait till the presentation is made through the whole section, and then we'll comment. Okay with you guys?
Good, yep.
Okay?
I think that did do it for transit facilities, so if that's all under that, we'll move on to architecture. Is that good? Sorry? Oh, are you?
Mr. Dollar is going to present here. Are you licensed?
License for this? I talked about this a little bit earlier, and when it comes to architectural standards, I think that we have been very, very lucky in terms of how a lot of the buildings in the city have taken shape. We've had relatively large numbers of good developers that have taken their plans a step further because they wanted them to look good. Our regulations deal, like I said before, almost entirely with size and scale and breaking up the massing associated with that. And for every one of those good developers, we've seen some that have come in with what is generally what we'll call a hodgepodge of design. And what we are looking to do is provide some clarity so that if you come in with a set of plans and you say that you are a Mediterranean revival or a Spanish Mediterranean revival, that is actually what you are. Or if you come in as an old Florida design, that is what you are. As opposed to mixing and matching different pieces of architecture which may or may not go together. We're looking for good design. That's the intent. It's not that we want to tell you what to build. We are not telling you which of these styles is required, but we are saying if you're going to call yourself a certain style, you need to be that style. As we go through, some of the general architectural standards. This deals kind of back with what I was discussing before, some of the massing issues, and also addressing the fact that we live in Florida and it gets hot and it rains. So covered walkways is something that we should expect as opposed to something that is occasional. Small retail stores. A lot of the large-scale retail or the big box will have different uses located within them. A Walmart will more than likely have an optometrist, McDonald's, maybe 2 or 3 other type uses. And what we're saying is if you have one of those in your building, set it up like an actual retail shop. It helps with the appearance of the building. If you have it up front, it looks like a standalone business. It helps break up that design. You are intending to put that use in your building anyway. So let's use it as an advantage both to the city and to the developer. And now we start to get into the specific styles. The first one is Old Florida. If you'll see the list of design requirements or design elements that you see in Old Florida, there will be a corresponding facade detail that will show a facade of a building that labels all of these elements so that if somebody's looking to put them on their plans, they can see exactly how we're defining it or how we will look at it. And that's going to be consistent through all of these architectural styles.
Excuse me, John.
Yes, sir.
Will there be available pictorial diagrams of these various?
That is just what I was talking about. Yes, sir. We will have a facade or a drawing of each of these architectural styles. And each of those architectural styles
Good.
will have each of these elements labeled so that you can see item, well, let me go back to the previous slide.
I get the picture.
Yeah, item B, lap siding. There'll be lap siding labeled so that you can see where it is used and how.
Yeah. John, also, some of them you have colors, or you can't use certain colors, and then some of them you left colors out. Are you going to be specific in the different styles with certain colors?
I will defer to Mr. Vincent.
I don't think so. I think we'll leave the colors up, that we have standards for the city as a whole.
Right, they still have to apply for
Right.
regular standards, and we
Earth
have
tone colors.
Okay, 'cause-
3600 color
Okay.
prohibitions.
One of them said no primary colors, and that was modern contemporary. You would think that would be where you would use the bold contemporary.
Well,
Red, blue,
Right, yeah, not in the other styles.
Right,
But that's the one that prohibits it. I'm just curious.
We beat the color horse to death here.
Yeah, I've heard it at some of the city council meetings, but I just didn't know if there were certain colors that are characteristic of certain styles, and you wanted to kind of go there.
Yeah, I think if I can answer that, in big box, for example, the IKEA has large blue all over the building. And so I think that might need to be addressed as we look again at these requirements.
Okay.
But as it stands right now, no primary colors are allowed, anywhere in the city.
I mean, somebody,
Correct.
if it was really something they needed, they could get a deviation if council approved it.
we have put that provision in, so that is possible. I don't know how that would be responded to if an application came in, but the process has been outlined, and
I think
John, one other little quick question here. We're talking about large scale, and we keep saying the name retail, but when you think about the retail market, this could be an auto agency.
it would have to be a very large auto
Well,
agency.
Germain is a very large one, and I'm quite sure it exceeds 150,000 square
Car
feet.
dealerships tend to be their own use with their own specific
But
regulations.
I look at this and I think this could be,
I would not look to apply these standards
Okay.
to an auto agency because they're intended to operate entirely different.
And we're going through the use regulation charts for all the different conventional zoning districts and noting which uses would be applicable to big box if they exceed the 40,000 square foot threshold. So,
well, having an automobile agency, for example, they want all the parking space up in
Right.
front next to the road so they can see the stock, inventory stock. And so that's just exactly opposite of what we're talking about here. And it went through my mind that there could be a stretch where 150,000 square feet would apply to a large operation like Germain's.
I would not look to apply
Okay.
these standards to that use.
Again, let me remind everyone that we want to go through these first and then have our comments later.
Sorry.
And the second architectural style we're going to address is Mediterranean Revival, the Italian edition. And these are the elements that we're looking at that would define that architectural style. And the Spanish edition. Modern contemporary, a little more free-flowing, not quite as specific, intentionally. And so what I think has happened is we have a pretty good list of those elements that define these styles. And I think that there is some pretty definitive guidance for an architect to come up with designs for certain buildings. If there's any questions or you think we've missed something or included too much, this might be a good time to voice your opinions. But I think that where we are right now is a pretty good place.
I have one. Do you have any other architects or professional design people looking at this for comments as well?
Yes, sir, I do. I have some architects in West Palm Beach looking at this.
Would it be out of line to, when we make a motion to pass this on or approve it, that it be, that those comments from those people be incorporated into that's presented to City Council?
I think that it would be entirely appropriate for us to bring those comments to council for their
That's fine, yes. that's-
evaluation.
Okay. One other thing, too, John didn't mention, under 5, there are other styles. If you want to present a different style, then you can do so as long as the intent is applied.
Yeah, and I think what we're going to, like I said, I'm very comfortable with where this will lead us. If in the future we decide we want to be more specific on some additional architectural styles, or we want to remove some architectural styles, that is always a possibility. But I think that right now, based on what we currently have, this puts us in a much better place.
Thank you, John.
Sure.
Next.
What's back to you?
Well, just the last thing under chapter 3 is, under the building standards, is a simple section regarding bollards, which often go in front of the stores and can be very simple concrete poles, or they can be done in a way that is architecturally consistent with the building, the way Target does the red round balls as their bollards, or in our example here, again, conceptual, we're just showing that a higher level of architectural detail is required beyond just your plain concrete bollard pole. So, pretty straightforward. So now we're getting into chapter 4, which means we're getting close to the end. Chapter 4 is not as heavy as chapter 3 is, so it's really just going through definitions, the approval process, and placement of the building on site. We've created some flexible options for the developers to consider to achieve, again, the aesthetic quality of the site we're looking to implement. So we kind of touched on this at the beginning of the presentation, is what is this going to be applicable to? We've defined the large-scale retail establishment in the next section. Again, 40,000 square feet, retail-oriented, or a shopping center exceeding 100,000 square feet. It would apply to, of course, a new big box coming into the city, a change of use that would result in a new big box, an existing big box expanding 50% of their existing square footage, which would exceed the square footage threshold. And this is what Mr. Vincent was talking about, the last option, which is a renovation or improvement exceeding 50% of the assessed value. And to avoid an incremental situation where they would go in and do $10,000 here, $10,000 there to stay under that threshold, we are creating a 5-year window of which those improvements could occur, that they could be subject to this, to avoid, a loophole, so to speak. We've proposed some definitions. These are all new terms for the code that we needed to define. Anchor building, your main department store within these shopping centers. Community space is what we discussed in the previous chapter, which could be implemented in a variety of ways. Your large-scale retail establishment, we've gone over that in detail. Liner building, I have some photos as we get into the conceptual diagrams of the site layout to better explain what that is, but that's really a separate, it can be attached to the big box, or more often not, it's a detached building that is shielding the view of the parking lot and oriented toward the street, like your Bonefish building on 41. That's a classic example of a liner building. And then monument style sign, this will likely be struck from the ordinance, considering we're taking our amendments to Chapter 6 out in lieu of staff's amendment. We are proposing a procedure for approval that large-scale establishments would undergo the plan development process. Again, there aren't going to be that many of these in the city of Bonita based on the population. So you got one shot. They're going to be there for a long time, and we really felt that allowing the public hearing process to get public input and, of course, city council direction was important for these specific types of developments. We also have a provision that existing plan developments can bring their MCP into compliance administratively to allow for a streamlined process for those wanting to come up to code. And then we've also, throughout both Chapter 3 and 4, provided for a deviation process, because we understand flexibility is needed, and there's different ways to meet the intent of this to create great-looking developments. So we are providing a process where they can propose alternatives so long as they are consistent with the intent. Oh, and I believe that's a double. All right, getting into the development standards, we proposed a maximum size of 150,000 square feet, which, again, could be deviated from based upon the data and analysis provided by the developer, but we thought that was an appropriate cap based upon the average size of your typical big boxes. We also addressed access, that it should be from a major arterial roadway, and that if there are secondary accesses to propose these development, they should not impact established residential neighborhoods, which would be subject to staff review, certainly through the PD process. We've proposed an increased setback from the side and rear yards, again, to protect adjacent properties and ensure compatibility, and provided provisions for outdoor display and storage to, again, ensure an appropriate view shed. So those are pretty straightforward. Were there any questions on those areas?
Yes.
Okay.
The setback from the rear of the store, that could be used for vehicle access.
Correct. You could have parking in that area. It's really for the structure, the principal structure.
It's a usable space, so that, for example, if it wanted to have the truck access, it could be in that as long as it was shielded with a fence and so forth.
Correct, yes.
So it's not,
not
we're
dead
not
area.
buying the dirt and not being able to use it. Okay.
Correct.
We're not up to page 24 or anything yet, are we? No. Okay.
No, we're at 23. We're about to be there. So
Could,
just closing out this section on the deliveries, we are proposing to limit the hours from 6:30 a.m. to 8 p.m. within the truck wells, and to have those areas gated to ensure appropriate deliveries.
could,
Getting into the building placement, this is really the wrap-up of this, and this is something, Estero has elements of this in their code. However, we tried to take it a step further and provide some flexibility through the process. So let's hit on these concepts. The first concept is your street orientation concept. This includes a maximum 25-foot setback, so your big box would be oriented towards the arterial roadway with building perimeter plantings in your buffer in front of the building and in between the roadway. And then that would entirely screen your parking, because the parking would be in the rear of the building. So as you're traveling around US 41 Bonita Beach Road, you'd see the building, you wouldn't see the parking area.
excuse me, would you go back to that again, please? Because I'm interpreting from the drawing that we're having a single access where the arrows are showing the parking area. So in essence, there is not access from the street frontage where the big box is what we're saying here.
That would typically be the case with this type of orientation.
But that could change depending upon the dimensions of the site. It's not to say you can't,
All right.
it just means just.
There's no, as, these are gonna be huge places, so that, it bothers me that we are, in essence, restricting to a single entrance, where we ought to have multiple entrances
And I
in
can
something
modify
as large
this.
as this.
Well,
Sir-
no, we're not restricting, this just happens to be how it was shown on the example. It
Okay,
doesn't mean
because
there
when you
wouldn't
go
be-
to the next one, it even gets more
Well,
defined.
if it eases your concerns a little bit, just imagine that on the left side of that area, there's another secondary frontage with another access off of there.
Okay.
Because that will
In
more
other
than likely
words,
be the case.
we are not in this ordinance restricting how access to the site is going to be.
No, sir.
Okay, very good.
And what was the setback minimum?
It's, in this case, it's a maximum setback, meaning your building has to be 25 foot from the property line. And I have this example of that scenario. I think your Bonefish and a lot of your development along 41, the newer development, are within that maximum setback. They've developed in that way to screen their parking areas and have the view from the road be the building. So, but this is not the only option. I want to be clear that there's, and I can update the figure. I appreciate your comments, Mr. Sims, that we can, further clarify that the intent here is not to limit to one access, but this is one acceptable building layout. Now, would I, in my professional planning opinion, would I think this would be the one that the developer would select? Most likely not, along your 41 or Bonita Beach Road. This may be for another portion of the city, but I mean, this is something more specific to an urban location, but it is achieving the intent we're looking to of an attractive streetscape.
Well, okay.
The next option, and I've added a figure that's not in your packet, but the next one we looked at was the outparcel concept, where our outparcel buildings are utilized to block the majority of your parking areas and break up your parking areas. So definitely in a suburban type environment, this would likely be the development option that would be selected by the big box.
Could we talk about that just a minute?
Yes, sir.
I'm using, for example, in my mind, Home Depot. They're in the back and they're in the front along 41 are a series of out parcels. Many of them have their own access. I mean, the bank and the gas station next door and so forth. While they're not right directly in front of the main store, they do have. So each one of these out parcels along the front border has access to 41.
That's going to depend more upon the Department of Transportation than it will on anything that's in these regulations.
Okay.
If they have the ability to get access, they'll probably take it, but it's
Well,
not.
let's just say in the ideal world, in the real world out there, that each one of the of this type of development, where we have a number of separate out parcels out in front, could be restaurants or banks, could be anything, but basically, they're not going to use the main entrance and go into the backside of the building. They're going to want access directly onto the highway.
They will, but that doesn't mean they're going to get it. There are situations where you will have multiple access points onto either US 41 or
Okay.
Beach Road for out parcels. but
And
there's
you're
also-
exactly right. And I look at Bob Evans out there.
And that would
It
access off the
failed
frontage road.
because you couldn't get into the place. So
Well,
they
there could
have
be a
to have
number of reasons.
access.
I don't know if I'd blame the access.
Yeah, I do. But the point of the whole thing is that once you settle on this design, then all at once you have multiple accesses to the highway, whereas, for example, on the previous one, where the big box was in the front, essentially we had a entrance around the corner or around and back or something. So I think this multiple out parcels in front has a tendency to increase the traffic congestion and the access to the highway and so forth and so on.
They're going to have to be providing traffic impact statements for whatever use they're looking for to justify whatever access points that they're requesting. The most you'll see are right in, right out access points off of those arterial roads. You aren't going to see a full median opening for an out parcel unless it just happens to be in the right place. The DOT is just not going to permit
Well,
that.
all the banks over on 41 out in front of Target and Publix there,
Target.
many of those have separate entrances directly onto 41.
Some of those do, and those also date back to a time when there was a little more leniency with access. At the time that those out parcels were developed, US 41 was a 4-lane road with 45-mile-an-hour speed limit right there.
Okay.
So some of that dates back to previous regulations. Some of that dates back to different design standards. But whatever somebody's going to request, they're going to have to justify, and it's going to have to be approved.
All right, if this concept is used and we have out parcels in the front, but we have a single entrance that everybody uses, then the front of the building along the street has to be in the back, because the customer is going to park in the back and they're going to walk in the door, which would be the front to them. It's the
Actually,
back.
we're going to be treating all those like fronts from an architectural standpoint.
I think it goes back to the bonefish again. That appears to be a front when you pass by it on 41, but it's fairly easy to come around and park in the back, which makes a real nice area because they've got a covered seating area, waiting area, and that's their main entrance.
Yes.
And Carol,
I think that's the
that's a
same
good
concept
example.
as this, isn't it?
Correct. And, you know, I'm getting great feedback on how I can make changes to make this better, because when I was designing these, it was really, where is the building on the site? The access was not really a driving factor in setting these up. It was really somewhat of an afterthought. Really, the point I was trying to get across is where the building should be placed. So we can look at creating a note about that this is not intended to dictate access to the site. Because as John said, really, I mean, on 41, it's going to be FDOT, and you got to get deviations if you want to do less than 440-foot spacing between your access points at this point. And I know I tried to get one recently to reduce that, and I couldn't do it. And I'll tell you, they have tightened up. So I think it's even more significant on Bonita Beach Road. So
Couldn't we address what Rex was concerned about by, even though DOT or FDOT is, or the county's DOT is going to have say on a lot of this, that we put in there that if you do this where you have the out parcels out front, which is a good idea, that there's a minimum distance that there has to be separation between entrances, so that even if
Generally on
it
an
was
arterial, it's 330 feet.
yeah.
It's already set.
that's in Chapter 3 already.
Yes, it's
So
already
you
set.
do have that, and to enforce that on smaller properties, we've looked at shared access and required it in certain places.
Right.
Either through frontage roads or reverse frontage roads, or somehow modifying access points onto the arterial road so that multiple properties have access to that. But really, when it comes to access points, it's almost predetermined. Either you have a median opening or you do not have a median opening, and if you don't have it, there's not much of a chance you're going to get it. So you need to figure out how to get people onto and off of your site, and there's only so many options. So I don't mind addressing it, but that's one of those questions when you're looking at a piece of property, it's almost predetermined. I mean, for properties that have secondary frontages, especially if there's a median opening there, that's going to be your access point, because it's going to be the easiest point to get people in and out of. If there is no secondary road and you have property on either side, then you're going to be looking at where do you bring them in directly onto your property. And that's going to be a spacing issue. It's going to be a design issue, but there's only going to be so many options.
Well, I think for me, what you have here seems to work, and a good example of that is the Outback and Carrabba's there. When I came here from another community, we allowed access everywhere and anywhere. And I can say here it's a lot safer when you round and get out of main traffic to enter a large development or to go to a restaurant or a drugstore or something like that. So I'm thinking that we're on the right track here at looking at these safer entrances.
When I was doing the reading on Albuquerque, one of the main problems they had with the big box stores and large amounts of traffic was the traffic congestion. And it appears to me, or it seems logical to me, that these kind of drawings, which bring people around in one location, bring them around to the side, is a better idea than having several entrances in the front, which slows down traffic and also makes it possible for people to rear end each other when somebody is turning in front of them. So this seems to me a workable idea.
Yes. Okay, if there are no comments, won't we proceed?
Okay, well, and since the ordinance was drafted, we did get some feedback that why would it be so unattractive to have some parking in front of your out parcels? Because when you look at a lot of the out parcels, there is at least a single row of parking in front of them. So John and I discussed, and we felt that there could be two out parcel options, one where the building is oriented 25 foot from the right of way, and a second option where you could have a row of parking to meet market demand and address that. So we've got the first one that you've seen, and then so that would be, I apologize for the blurriness of the picture. That concept would result in a building that would be pushed up against the road like this example. It's oriented towards the road with the parking on the side and in the back. And now I have created a figure 2A with a small parking area up front, which we could specify as a single or double loaded parking aisle. And that would get you your typical out parcel type design, but a situation where it's not set back so far that you get 50 parking spots in front of your building. So again, trying to create some flexibility and respond to some of the comments we received. And then the last concept was the liner building concept. We've mentioned Bonefish a lot. That was somewhat the inspiration for this concept, where you've got your large scale in the back and you've got your liner providing that screening from the front. I've used this example already as an example of a liner building concept. And then, of course, your Bonefish. And I think we can all agree when we look at that picture, I mean, that's beautiful Bonita. That was a good quality development, and we'd like to see redevelopment occur along 41 that look more like this, I think, is safe to say. All right, Chapter 6 amendments. We are removing that from this ordinance and will be addressed separately by staff. That concludes the amendments.
Okay, any comments?
Yeah, I have one. I went to one of those continuing education seminars that I know Mr. Vincent's familiar with. And one of the things, they were talking about this very issue of incremental upgrades, renovations, whatever you want to call it. And a number of the people commented that, number one, I'm glad we're using the assessed value because that gets out of the fictitious appraisals and all that. But my question probably is more for Audrey. The comment was made fairly flippantly by a lot of the people there that, well, what we're going to have to do is get our contractors to lie a little more on what the cost of the incremental improvements are. What's the penalty for?
Well, there's good news there because we generally use ICC values.
Okay.
For coming up with the cost of that construction. So
in
it's
other
gonna
words,
be more
there's
of
a minimum that no matter what they say it's going to cost us.
Correct. Otherwise, we do, if someone wants to bring in a signed contract, we will evaluate that, and there are times we've accepted it. For the most part, it's not really a big deal.
Right.
But in other areas, it has been. Where we see it now is when you look at more conflicts with FEMA regulations, but this would be bringing in a new element into that. But if you're looking at comparing a contract to ICC values, it's going to be plus or minus a small percentage.
Mm-hmm. Okay.
And if it's more than that, obviously the scope is different.
Right.
Okay, let's move on to, Audrey, I think.
We're going to do this separately?
Well, we're going to vote on this now. We vote at the end after we look at item B.
No, you would do it at this particular ordinance. We do each ordinance separate. So if you're ready,
Let me make
Yeah,
a
we're
motion.
ready for a motion?
Well,
Yeah,
I have
I
one
make-
question.
Comments?
I did have some typos. Can we do those later?
absolutely.
Okay.
Yeah. I make a motion that we approve it, subject to correcting the typos, as well as John providing to city council the comments of any of these other architectural organizations or professionals that he's getting comments from when it's presented.
Okay, do I hear a second?
I'll second it.
Okay, we have a second. Vote? I'm sorry, before we vote, public comment on this portion. Are there any comments from the public? Okay, thank you very much. Now we can take a vote. Thank you, John. Deborah? Debbie?
Chairman Vincent,
Aye.
Don Colapetro,
Aye.
Rick Sims,
Aye.
Fred Forbes,
Aye.
Carolyn Gallagher.
Aye.
Motion is passed. Thank
Okay,
you.
the next ordinance, and it's a much smaller one, it's an ordinance of the City of Bonita Springs, amending the zoning ordinance by amending Table 4-843 Use Regulations for Conventional Commercial Districts to require that any properties having certain uses within 100 feet from US 41 Tamiami Trail be permitted only by planned development or special exception, providing for conflict, severability, codification, inclusion in code, scrivener's errors, and an effective date. The affidavit of publication is available at the clerk's office. I want to point out that this particular ordinance, we're currently working under what's called a zoning in progress. So we adopted a resolution that prohibits certain uses from developing unless they have a planned development or special exception. We have that, it's a 90-day resolution. This is the first prong of the changes to this particular section. As we mentioned during the last ordinance, we're also changing the sign code to have language in there, not just for the large-scale retail, but also addressing those signs. This one is pretty simple. There's now a new addition, which is Note 22. Note 2, I'm sorry. Note 2 was reserved, so we put it back into business. And Note 2 states, if located within 100 feet from the right-of-way of US 41, so this is not Old 41, this is not Bonita Beach Road or anywhere else in the city, this use is permitted only by planned development zoning on parcels larger than 1 acre. On parcels 1 acre or less in area, special exception approval is required. And I noticed there's, the word is missing. So I got that one.
That wasn't the one I had.
And to make this easy, this is very similar to the Bonita Beach Road overlay. The only thing that is really different is we added a few of the automotive and uses and tattoo parlors that would also require either planned development or special exception approval.
And I want to point out, we're working off of the April 25th ordinance. The one that City Council will have personal services Group 2. We'll have Note 2 on it also.
Personal service
And
group
that,
4.
Group 4, I'm sorry. And that is the tattoo parlors. We're not prohibiting them. We're just requiring that they go in for plan development. And that's so that staff can add conditions necessary to buffer any uses to make it so it provides an aesthetic viewpoint.
What are we doing about gas stations? Like the big racetrack on Bonita Beach Road?
The racetrack on Bonita Beach Road is actually a planned development.
Right.
So in this particular case, what we're looking at would have been consistent. Now, it was approved, and the development order was approved prior to several changes that we made in our land development code, which is why you see the canopy look the way it does. But there are also other architectural conditions to the building that are there because it is a planned development.
I'm a little confused here. This is a revision of an existing ordinance.
This is, what you're looking at is a revision to the commercial use table. So if you look on page
Okay, what pages I didn't see anything underlined that shows that we're making a change.
Well, the changes is going to be, if you look under the special notes or regulations,
See the
what you're
word
going to
note
look
two.
Note
for
two.
is the number 2, and the number 2 where it is located, the first time you will see it is on page 3, and it is under auto parts store,
Okay.
no installation service is the first instance. And all of those uses that have a note 2 are those that would go under the plan development or special exception requirement for this proposed ordinance.
John, addressing that, I see one here, and I'm wondering if it would apply in the future here for farm equipment sale, storage, and rental. For example, the new store that's in the Bonita Bay Shopping Center,
Yes, sir.
would that would apply in that situation, right?
Yes, sir.
They wouldn't be able to have a store like that.
If it was strictly retail that had a broad base or broad inventory, that could be one thing. But when it gets into some of the uses that they
Say
have,
specifically farm,
yes, sir.
Okay.
Then that would apply.
because they've got farm equipment, feed, chickens, everything.
No longer chickens.
No longer chickens.
We have an ordinance, we can have chickens now in.
You can have them, but you can't sell them. That was temporary.
You have to do steal them?
I don't think you can have roosters.
Chicken wrestling, that'll be the new thing.
Are we ready for ordinance?
Yeah, I think, any questions or comments on this portion? Any comments from the public? Okay, there are none, so I'd like to take a vote, please. It's our motion.
I'll move to approve.
Second?
A second.
It's been seconded, so moved. Vote, please.
Carolyn Gallagher,
Aye.
Fred Forbes,
Aye.
Rex Sims,
Aye.
Chairman Vincent,
Aye.
Don Colapetro.
Aye.
That concludes the meeting for today. The next meeting is set for Thursday, June 12th. Is that agreeable? Okay, that's agreeable and so set. Approval of the minutes?
I make a motion to approve.
Any second?
I second.
I'll make that, I'll do the second. I had one, there was just one typo on
Okay.
one page. I'm digging it out here, if I can find it.
And before we do that, we might want to address any errors, spelling, things like that?
Give 'em
I
to
can
her.
do it now, or I can do it with Audrey offline.
Actually, minutes go to Debbie.
Okay,
Okay. I got that one
Done?
circled away. That's fine.
Well,
Okay.
so it's, okay, second, approval of the minutes. Did I take a second? You said second?
Yep, second.
Okay, so approved. Okay, we're adjourned.
Very good.
Mr. Chairman,
okay,
before we
my
adjourn,
comment. Misspellings and typos on the ordinances.
Okay, I'm interested in the,
So it's just a cleanup. I mean,
Yeah.
it's not a,
I have to go.
One more comment here, I think. Excuse me?
not a comment, it's a request.
Request.
I'd
Yes.
like to be excused for the next 4 meetings. We'll be on the road.
Oh,
that's fine.
Only if we get to go with you.
Alaska?
Oh, I don't know about all. We could have a lottery and pick one, but.
I don't think Jamie would be too happy.
That's
No, no.
excusable. Okay, we're adjourned.